Good afternoon. Welcome to FTA's Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Implementation webinar. To get us started, we will turn to FTA Administrator Nuria Fernandez.
Good afternoon and Happy New Year. And thank you so much for joining us today. So, you know what, this is a very exciting time for transit industry. With the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we're looking to do some amazing things with you, with the highest funding level for transit we have seen in our lifetime. So planning for implementation of the $108 billion of investment in transit over 5 years is both a huge undertaking and extremely rewarding. After all, many of us have spent our careers wanting and waiting for this moment. So I want to start by thanking you again. Many of you joining us today played a very important role in helping get the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law across the finish line. And to every one of you who helped emphasize transit's critical role in our communities and made the case for public transportation to be one of the legislation's biggest winners ever. So thank you. As you know, now it's time to look forward. So our goal today is to provide a summary of the legislation, and we're going to focus on how it impacts FTA's programs. Plans are underway for us to launch the 4 new competitive grant programs that were authorized in the legislation, and we're also going to be expanding 9 of our existing grant programs. The new law also gives us the tools so that we can improve transit safety, so that we can replace and rebuild infrastructure that is years past its prime, so that we can help combat the climate crises and make transportation more accessible and equitable for everyone. And in the process, it will also help us create a generation of middle-class jobs. So over the last month, we held listening sessions with several groups of stakeholders, as well as meeting with dozens of transit professionals at the APTA Expo in Orlando. And we heard about your priorities as FTA looks to implement the legislation. We heard that there is a need for additional technical assistance from FTA as we roll out the competitive grant programs, particularly the new programs, that there is a need for speed to make funding available, and that there's a desire for us to continue with an ongoing open dialogue with the industry as we move forward with the implementation process. So hearing from you about what is most important as we begin the implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL, has been extremely helpful. In the coming weeks, we're going to focus more on our efforts on technical assistance. We also plan to issue a partial apportionment by the end of this month, followed by the first in a series of Novos. Also, with this in mind, we will be adding some new team members throughout the year so that we can help administer this once-in-a-generation opportunity. So as we implement the new legislation, I promise you that FTA will continue to keep the lines of communications open and act with both speed and transparency. So before I turn this over to Paul, let me hit a few of the high notes from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that will enable us to accomplish several things. The first is we will be able to help you replace old rail cars and buses and modernize throughout the industry so that agencies across the country can reduce the transit maintenance backlog. With additional funding through our expansion programs will include the potential to significantly expand the Capital Investment Grants Program, which will help transit agencies add new routes and increase service. We'll also make transit more accessible for seniors and people with disabilities through programs like the All Stations Accessibility Program, which will provide $1.75 billion to upgrade legacy rail transit stations that remain inaccessible. And we also have an additional $5.6 billion to replace thousands of transit buses with clean, zero-emission vehicles. So all of this will connect more people with jobs, schools, hospitals, grocery stores, affordable housing, and services in communities large and small. As Secretary Buttigieg has said, this is not only about transportation. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will greatly expand opportunities and also environmental justice. Last month, we posted fact sheets with information on funding allocations and eligible activities, as well as details on new programs or changes in some of our existing programs. After our presentation today, we will take some of your questions through the chat feature. If we are unable to get to your question, I encourage you to contact us by email at fta fta-iija@dot.gov. That email address is also on our website. Now, I'd like to turn this over to Paul Kinkade, FTA's Associate Administrator for Communications and Congressional Affairs. Paul?
Thanks, Daria. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining our presentation today. My name is Paul Kinkade. I'm the Associate Administrator for Communications and Congressional Affairs here at the Federal Transit Administration. And we're excited today to take a look at the historic Bipartisan Infrastructure Law with all of you here today. The U.S. federal government will invest more into public transportation to connect Americans to their communities than ever before, thanks to President Biden's signing of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the largest investment in American infrastructure in generations. $108 billion over the next 5 years for public transportation. That's the largest federal investment in transit we've ever seen. Agencies are going to get more funding to give more people a chance to connect with their community, and there'll be a renewed focus on equity, workers, and fighting the battle of our time against climate change. These are key Biden-Harris administration priorities as we move to a clean, American-made transportation future. There haven't been a lot of earth-shattering policy changes in this legislation, but we do want to talk about some of the changes and program improvements that have been made. We also want to let you know more about the investment that's going to be made over the next 5 years. And at the end of the presentation, as Nuria noted, we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have questions anytime during the presentation, just click the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, fill out your name and where you're from, and put your question in. We'll have people gathering up all those questions, and if we don't answer yours today, we will get to as many as we can on the presentation and then send out emails for the rest of them, hopefully. Again, provide your name, organization, and email address with your questions so we can make sure somebody from the FTA team gets back to you with a response. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law of 2021 was signed into law by President Biden on November 15th of last year. While it is a generational investment, it's also just a normal surface transportation bill, reauthorizing the Federal Transit Administration programs for fiscal years 2022 to 2026. In total, the law authorizes $108 billion over 5 years for public transportation. That includes $91 billion in guaranteed funding. The new reauthorization is a 72% increase over the FAST Act, the most significant federal investment, as we've said, in American public transportation. It significantly impacts our state of good repair investments, low and no emission bus grants, and capital improvement grants. The guaranteed funding is especially significant because it includes a combination of funding from the Mass Transit account of the Highway Trust Fund and from advanced appropriations, which provide additional funding from the General Fund of the United States for every year of the authorization. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, advanced appropriations are additional funding that Congress has provided for each year of the authorization over the next 5 years. This funding is over $21 billion, and it's a guaranteed addition to each year of the money that Congress will be authorizing, or that they will appropriate in the upcoming years for CIG grants, for low and no emission bus grants, for state of good repair grants, and for our 5310 programs. It includes guaranteed funding for the new ASAP grants, which is our All Stations Accessibility Program, and 2 new ferry programs that are authorized in the law. In short, the advance appropriations are a big deal because we know right now that we'll be sending these additional funds to transit agencies over the next 5 years. Additionally, there's $17 billion authorized for future annual appropriations over the next 5 years. That's money Congress will have to appropriate, but it's already authorized for our use once they do appropriate it. That includes $15 billion for potential new capital improvement grant programs, $750 million for WMATA capital investments here in Washington, D.C., and just over $1 billion to supplement 2 new passenger ferry grant programs that I'll talk about in a little bit, along with funding for the 4 new discretionary grant programs some of you will be eligible to compete for. So let's first take a look at the changes in funding for FTA. This graph demonstrates the drastic changes between the FAST Act and the new law in funding levels for our agency. It also demonstrates we'll be getting a little more each year. It's not a flat level. Lumping together all the different kinds of funding outlined in the bill, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law represents a 72% increase in Federal Transit Administration funding when compared with the FAST Act. Here's a couple more charts that'll show what this means at a more granular level. On the left side, you can see how really significant these increases are. The left bar chart shows our formula and discretionary programs from FY21 under the FAST Act. The right bar chart are the levels authorized for FY22, including more than double the discretionary funding and more than 40% more formula funding. To the right, you'll see a pie chart that shows the funding levels in FY22 for all of our programs. You can see that a significant portion of FTA's budget each year is made up of formula funding. both for urbanized areas and for the state of good repair. The remaining portions show our various competitive programs, including now over $1 billion annually for the low and no emission bus grants, to transition to low and zero emission vehicles and to purchase fueling and maintenance infrastructure for those. You'll also see our 4 new competitive grants program represented. Also, under other, there's increases in funding for programs like transit research, our bus testing program, and others. Most of these programs received increases under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Not to paraphrase Spider-Man here, but we understand this additional funding comes with more responsibility for FTA and our recipients to manage these public dollars more effectively. One of the concerns we've heard is whether FTA will have the resources that we need to implement and oversee this generational funding. I want to assure all of you now, on behalf of our administrator and on behalf of our team that is about to grow, we have a plan, we've been given the proper resources, and we look forward to working with the entire transit industry to deliver success. We understand implementation is a two-way street, though, and we're looking for ways to ease the administrative impact on our recipients through our existing authorities. We'll also be providing support through our regional offices, through FTA as a whole, and through our Technical Assistance and Workforce Program to help transit agencies increase their capacity to manage these additional funds. We also look forward to working with groups throughout the country who are already great technical assistance centers for agencies to make sure they have the information they need to help these agencies remain competitive and ensure compliance. Part of this presentation is to tell you about the new law, but we've also heard some specific questions from you that we want to answer now. One of them is about our timeline for apportioning FY22 formula funds and when we plan to issue Novos for new and existing programs. To the first point, the biggest missing piece for us is a full year FY22 appropriation by Congress. The current continuing resolution extends FY21, which is the FAST Act levels, until February 18th of this year. With that in mind, we are on schedule, as the administrator said, to publish partial year apportionment tables with the funding that we currently have available. We plan to do so by the end of January, so our grantees will have access to the funding available under that continuing resolution. As far as guidance is concerned, that apportionment notice, which will include interim guidance on many of the changes and new programs under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. In the meantime, we'd encourage everyone to review the detailed program fact sheets on our website. It also includes a link to an email address where you can send us any specific questions you have, and the email address will also be shown at the end of this presentation. The timing of our Novos for many of our competitive grant programs will also depend on the full year appropriations from Congress, but we do intend to issue them on a rolling basis, starting very soon with our bus and bus facilities competitions, as well as the low and no emission bus competitions, which will be announced first. Again, this is an exciting time to be working with American Transit. We stand on the precipice of a generational increase in investment. We've heard a lot of questions about implementation of this legislation since the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was introduced and when it was passed. We want to address some of them here. First, we're open to your questions, suggestions, and comments. FTA has held several listening sessions, talked to numerous agencies and manufacturers and other stakeholders, as well as meeting with a lot of you at conferences. Those lines of communications remain open. We also want you to know that we're not starting from a standstill. For FTA, the starting gun on implementation went off early last year when discussions began on Capitol Hill. The ideas and concepts in this bill are not a surprise to FTA. We've been involved in the process that resulted in this legislation and started preparing to implement it before the bill was even signed into law. As a result, you can visit our website to read the fact sheets we talked about earlier and learn more about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And you can be assured that the process of creating guidance on changes to programs will remain the same. We also welcome you to speak with your FTA regional offices to learn more about how the law will impact your community and your region. Finally, for agencies large and small across the country, FTA stands ready with technical assistance for you to make sure you can take advantage of every opportunity in this landmark legislation to improve and build new transit in your community. Now we'd like to take a look at 4 key priorities FTA will look to address in implementing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The first priority is safety through enhancing state safety oversight programs, strengthening rail inspection practices to protect transit workers and riders from injuries, and ensuring safe access to transit. The second is modernization, reducing the backlog of state of good repair investments by repairing and upgrading aging transit infrastructure. The third is climate. President Biden and Vice President Harris have made combating climate change one of the hallmarks of their administration, We know that transportation is the top emitting industry in the country, and that public transportation has always played an important role in curbing those emissions and traffic congestion. We'll protect the earth and our kids from pollution, keeping air and water cleaner by replacing buses and ferries with cleaner, greener vehicles. Finally, another key Biden-Harris agenda focus is that of equity. Through the president's executive orders, including Justice 40, we've been directed at federal agencies to ensure that 40% of the benefits of federal spending reach previously marginalized communities. And through other efforts, FTA will focus on ensuring we view all of transit through a lens of equity, improving service for communities that have historically had more limited access to transit, while providing for substantial upgrades to increase accessibility to current opportunities and supporting minority and women-owned businesses through our Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. Secretary Buttigieg and Administrator Fernandez have said over and over again, safety is our North Star. Ensuring safety for riders, workers, and the public remains a crucial priority for this administration and for the FTA. We've been more acutely aware during the COVID pandemic that public transportation is an essential service, and it is critical that we ensure the safety of workers who operate these essential services and the people who rely on them. We'll collect more data on safety incidents and operator assaults, providing more opportunities and resources for transit agency staff training, continuing to promote adoption of safety management systems, and enhancing oversight of safety requirements and regulations. And as FTA continues to work to promote modern, safe, and efficient transit infrastructure, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will boost transit funding for communities across the country by an average of 30%, helping communities address maintenance backlog, modernizing and expanding their systems. And this will be achieved by providing funding to repair and replace aged and outdated transit infrastructure, incorporating new technologies, and building transit to serve growing communities and communities that currently lack sufficient mobility options. FTA will also continue prioritizing climate considerations, working with transit agencies to further reduce carbon emissions and address the need for more resilient transit systems. This includes reducing carbon emissions from transit vehicles, infrastructure, and construction, strengthening transit systems to respond to climate change and extreme weather, and supporting the adoption of American-made low and zero-emission vehicle technologies. To meet these goals, FTA will focus discretionary investments on projects that address the climate crisis. FTA will provide technical assistance to transit agencies to support adoption of zero-emission vehicles, and will continue to invest in research and innovation that helps us better understand and reduce the environmental impacts of transportation. FTA will also focus on improving equity and equitable outcomes as a primary goal. We'll expand access and opportunity to all communities, with a particular focus, as we said, on communities that have been traditionally underserved, overburdened, and disadvantaged. We want to incorporate equity into all phases of the transportation planning and funding process to increase social, economic opportunity through investments in equitable transit projects. As I mentioned, the Justice 40 initiative is a significant effort by the Biden-Harris administration to ensure that disadvantaged communities fully benefit from federal investments. The president's executive order calls for at least 40% of the benefits of our new investments to reach these communities. FTA will accomplish this goal by providing resources and technical assistance to ensure that underserved and disadvantaged communities have an opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. We'll also prioritize discretionary funding for projects that have a clear connection with promoting equitable outcomes. We'll be conducting proactive outreach and technical assistance to underserved and disadvantaged communities. Part of this will include focusing discretionary investments on projects that promote equity and provide benefits to these communities as well. We're also looking at collecting data that will enable FTA to better assess the impact of transit service on disadvantaged communities and to determine how federal investments can best address historic inequities. We want to ensure that these new investments in public transportation also support minority and women-owned businesses through our Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. Now, I want to run through the changes in the law by program area. Our formula programs, competitive programs, planning, environment, CIG, safety, and other changes pertaining to research and innovation, as well as administration. I will note before I dive in here, many of these changes will be implemented in various forms of guidance over the next several months and even years. We understand this information is coming fast and furious at you, but I can promise that FTA intends to help the transit industry, including ourselves, implement this new law with all due speed, but not so much that it leaves anyone behind. We don't intend to eat the elephant all in one bite, and we don't expect that from you either. I mentioned the fact sheets on our website are a great resource for some initial guidance on these programmatic changes. You'll also find interim guidance in our FY22 apportionment notice when that's published at the end of the month. It'll give you some more details. We'll also be including guidance in various forms of notices of funding opportunity, and we'll be disseminating Dear Colleague letters that will provide notifications. There will be formal guidance and agency circulars that will need to be updated to reflect the new policy and program changes. Those updates will take time to produce, particularly so that we can publish notice and comment. I encourage everyone to sign up for our GovDelivery system if you haven't already, so you can stay up to date with all the latest information from FTA. In addition to much needed funding, there are programmatic changes to FTA's formula programs. These funds will support the administration's priorities of providing safe, equitable, clean, and reliable transportation for people who rely on these services. As we increase funding by 30% to urbanized areas, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires recipients that serve urbanized areas with populations of more than 200,000 to allocate at least 0.75% of those formula funds to safety-related projects. Meanwhile, on the rural side, 5% of our rural formula funding will be available for public transportation on Indian reservations, with 20% of that in a competitive program and the rest apportioned by formula. In addition, 3% of our rural formula program is available for the Appalachian Development Public Transportation Assistance Program. The Grants for Bus and Bus Facilities formula distribution is increased to $4 million for each state and $1 million for each territory in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. These funds can be used anywhere in the state or territory and are in addition to those provided only for urbanized areas. It is incredibly important to FTA that we put buses on the street as soon as possible, particularly those that move us toward an electric future. The FAST Act previously authorized the use of innovative procurement tools, such as cooperative procurement, state schedules, and leasing. We know individual customized buses are important to address geographical, climate, and other needs. However, if you can work together, either with transit vehicle manufacturers or with other agencies, to create larger procurements with less customization, that will help tremendously in all the work that we're trying to do here with our authorization. And so we encourage that, and you'll see it reflected in our notice of funding opportunities. Sorry, just a little technical glitch here. We will, I'm just getting back to where we were here. There are 4 new competitive grant programs also established in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Competitive grants for rail vehicle replacement provide $300 million a year to replace rail rolling stock that is past its useful life and is a significant investment in addressing the state of good repair backlog, which is currently estimated at $105 billion. For the first time in the history of American transit, we're providing funding specifically to ensure that the trains that serve our communities are safe and up to date and as efficient as possible. We also have the All Stations Accessibility Program, which will be used to upgrade legacy rail transit stations that remain inaccessible to individuals with disabilities. The Electric or Low Emitting Ferry Pilot Program will support the transition of passenger ferries to low and zero emission technologies. And finally, the Ferry Service for Rural Communities programs will provide funding for improving access and mobility, connecting Americans and communities with nautical access to jobs, education, healthcare, and other important services. FTA's planning programs are updated as well. Consideration of housing programs has been added to the transportation and planning process, while there's new requirements that MPOs ensure the consistency of data used in planning if more than one MPO is designated in an urban area. MPOs are also now required to consider the equitable and proportional representation of their planning area's population when designating officials. They're also now permitted to use social media and other web-based tools to encourage participation in planning. Finally, there's some updates to the federal share and eligible activities. The law permits more than 80% federal share for planning in lower density or lower income portions of metro or adjacent rural areas. It also broadens eligibility under our TOD pilot program to permit federal funding for site-specific and comprehensive planning. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law also codifies the elements of the rescinded One Federal Decision executive order into federal law. One Federal Decision, now referred to as major projects, has several provisions. DOT must develop a schedule to complete an environmental impact statement within 2 years, and it requires accountability to the public via a dashboard, which will be the federal permitting dashboard currently in use for all FTA environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. FTA's largest discretionary grant program is still CIG, the Capital Improvement or Investment Grants Program. It funds fixed guideway investments, including rapid rail, commuter rail, light rail, streetcars, and bus rapid transit. There are 3 categories of eligible projects under CIG: new starts, small starts, and core capacity. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law revises small starts and new starts eligibility thresholds, with small starts projects now less than $400 million and seeking CIG funding of less than $150 million, where new starts are now projects that cost more than $400 million, seeking CIG funding of $150 million or more. Core capacity project eligibility will now extend to corridors that are at capacity today or will be within 10 years instead of the previous 5. There's also a new process for bundling of projects to allow sponsors to move multiple projects through the CIG pipeline simultaneously. In addition, the Secretary of Transportation will now be responsible for determining a project sponsor has made progress toward meeting the transit asset management performance targets. FTA will also begin publishing a dashboard on our public website, updated monthly with information on each project seeking CIG funding. Requirements for before and after studies, which analyze predicted versus actual cost and ridership outcomes, were also revised. Rather than project sponsors conducting these studies, the GAO will report to Congress on the difference between predicted and actual outcomes for projects. Lastly, our congressional notification timeline before a CIG grant can be awarded has changed from 30 days to 15 days for new starts and core capacity projects. Similarly, the law revises the congressional notification timeframe required before an EPD program letter of intent or construction grant can be awarded from 30 days to 15. As I've noted before, Secretary Buttigieg and Administrator Fernandez refer to safety as our North Star. We've referenced priorities several times in this presentation, but it's important to know that safety has and always will be the greatest among equals. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law reflects this by enhancing state safety oversight programs, including strengthening rail inspection practices. Additional updates will also improve safety training, work to reduce assaults on vehicle operators, and institute measures to reduce vehicular and pedestrian accidents, including buses. We know transit agencies have worked throughout the pandemic to try to create safer systems for employees and riders. To build on this knowledge, FTA will add content to our public transportation safety plan in consultation with the Department of Health and Human Services to include safety measures for riders and transit workers during a public health emergency. Recipients of Urbanized Area Formula Program grants will need to certify that agency safety plans are consistent with Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and state health authority guidelines to minimize exposure to infectious diseases. Other provisions include updates related to research, bus testing, and national transit database reporting. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law directs FTA to establish advanced digital construction management systems and allows flexibility and authority for low and no emission bus component testing facilities to use funds to conduct research related to advanced vehicle technologies. In the bus testing program, federal funds can now be used by our testing center to purchase equipment and fund capital projects related to testing new models. This will expand the capacity of the bus testing center to keep up with new models. There are also additional requirements for reporting to the NTD: geographic service area coverage, data related to assaults on transit workers, and fatalities resulting from impacts with bus. It's FTA's hope that these additional requirements will assist transit agencies in meeting equity and safety goals. Finally, additional changes were made to FTA's Joint Development Program, the Administrative Provisions for Disposition, and FTA's Emergency Relief Program. Under joint development, electric vehicle infrastructure is now an eligible expense, though in some instances, grantees will need to recoup funds by charging for personal vehicles. For disposition, if an asset is valued at more than $5,000 and it's sold, recipients can keep the first $5,000 and the remainder of any non-federal share for the amount above $5,000. However, the federal share of funds now will need to be returned to FTA and cannot be kept, even if it's for public transportation use. And while it's not part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we'd be remiss if we didn't let you know that the recently passed National Defense Authorization Act also included a provision expanding property disposition to permit transfers for TOD projects with affordable housing under certain circumstances. Finally, applicants for emergency relief funds will need to submit proof of insurance as required by federal law and certify compliance with state insurance laws. So that's our presentation for the day. Please check out the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law website for regular updates and new materials. You can direct questions, as Administrator Fernandez said, to our email at fta-iija@dot.gov. You can also contact your FTA regional office if you need assistance. Our regional offices will also be hosting region-specific webinars like this one in the near future. Now, let's kick off our Q&A portion of the event. Again, please keep sending us your questions via the Q&A pod. I'm joined today by some of FTA's leadership team who will help me answer some of your questions. We won't have time to get to all the questions today, but we will get to as many as we can. Again, click the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, put in your name and where you're from, as well as your question and your email address. We'll make sure that FTA gets back to you, even if we don't answer your question today. Our first question today is, transit agencies consider it an urgent priority to access the additional funding offered in this bill. How can FTA facilitate a quick availability of these funds? And for that, I'm going to hand it over to somebody a lot of you know, Bruce Robinson, FTA's Associate Administrator for Program Management, who will help answer this question. Bruce?
Thank you, Paul. As the Administrator noted, and as Paul noted, we are under a continuing resolution, and currently we only have funding available through February 18th of 2022 at the the fiscal year 21 FAST Act levels, so about $3.9 billion. We are currently working to post those partial year apportionment tables on our website by the end of this month. We understand that many of you will want to wait to apply for funds once the full year tables are developed and posted, and we will work to do so as quickly as possible once we have a full year appropriation. We also plan to begin issuing notices of funding opportunity later this month as well. There were many questions about whether there's a table of when those notices of funding opportunity will be posted. Unfortunately, we're not able to identify that yet, given some complications of being under the continuing resolution.
Thanks, Bruce. And here at TCA, at the Office of Congressional and Communications, we'll be watching Congress very closely for the appropriations procedures to occur, to see what's going to happen there. And obviously, we'll be working with all of the departments at FTA, including Bruce's, to make sure that we get you information as quickly as possible about apportionments, both by the end of January and for the rest of the year, as soon as that information becomes available. We've got another question, and hopefully Bruce can stay with us. The next question is there a timeline for the Novos that will be offered under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law? Bruce?
Right, and I think I was just trying to address that latter part of that question too, that we don't have a timeline or schedule for all the notices of funding opportunity, partly because of complications being under the continuing resolution. There are some restrictions on what programs we can move out on, but we are trying to advance the Novos, and we hope once we do have a full year appropriation that we're able to move out on all the programs in a kind of a regular order and schedule.
Thanks, Bruce. And as we noted, the notice of funding opportunities for bus and bus facilities and low and no emission bus should be coming out relatively soon. So be sure you're signed up for GovDelivery so you can get those Novos when they hit the streets. Our next question is, what will the impacts of the 2020 census be? When will FTA begin using the new population data for apportioning funding? For that one, I'm going to toss it over to Teresa Kohler, our Associate Administrator for the Budget and Policy Programs. Teresa?
All right, thank you, Paul. So right now we are waiting for the census to release the results of the 2020 urbanized area populations and boundary maps. We're expecting that we're going to use that data starting with the FY 2023 awards. So in the meantime, we are going to be requesting comments on the procedures that we're going to put in place to do this via the Federal Register notice. So that is going to be coming out in shortly in the next couple of months. So stay tuned for that.
Great, thanks, Teresa, appreciate it. Our next question is, will there be any changes to eligibility in regard to Buy America in advancing capital projects and initiatives? And for that, we're going to turn it over to Dana Novosi from our Chief Counsel's Office. Dana?
Thanks, Paul. FTA does not have the ability to carve out areas in which Buy America does or doesn't apply under the law. And so, the requirement is that it applies to all projects that are funded by Chapter 53 funding. I'd also like to note that a provision of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law which of course has its own acronym for the Build America, Buy America section called BABA, is that it applies Buy America to construction materials as well as steel, iron, and manufactured products. OMB is charged with putting out guidance on how to implement those provisions, and they will go into effect, or we will have to start enforcing it within 180 days of enactment of the statute, which was November 15th. So stay tuned for more on guidance on how we're going to be applying construction materials to our programs.
Thank you, Dana. Our next question is regarding the before and after study we talked about. As we discussed, FTA will not be responsible for the before and after studies any longer. That responsibility will be moved to GAO. And so the question is, are the requirements or processes for the before and after studies being updated or changed with the reassignment to the Government Accounting Office? And if so, what requirements and changes will there be? And so for that one, we're going to toss it over to Felicia James. Felicia?
Yes, thank you, Paul. And good afternoon, everyone. So there was this update made to the before and after study report that has to be compiled and provided to Congress on an annual basis from FTA. That report, as noted by Paul, now it has been transferred to the responsibility of the GAO as part of its biannual review of the CIG program. And so they will be reporting to Congress the differences between the predicted and actual outcomes of the CIG projects. With respect to what that means in regards to the requirements and what information will be required from the project sponsors to report to FTA and or GAO, we're still in conversations with them as of right now, but we'll definitely be communicating to the industry on where that information will, how that will land when we move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Felicia. Our next question is for Bruce Robinson. Hopefully we can bring him back. This is a question we've actually heard from a number of folks in smaller and small urban markets. Is FTA planning to offer additional technical assistance, particularly for new competitive grant programs and new grant requirements, such as the fleet transition plans? Bruce, can you help us out with that a little bit?
Sure. For each program, we are planning to hold webinars describing the eligibility criteria, program requirements, particularly for the new programs, as well as modifications to our existing programs. As many of you know, most of our programs, when we receive applications, they're vastly oversubscribed. And we do offer, for all unsuccessful applicants, briefings that we often see result in improved applications in the next cycle. And then, of course, we have our technical assistance centers, such as the National Rural Transit Assistance Program, who have developed webinars and recordings that are available on best practices in grant writing. So we'll continue to develop technical assistance and as people work on applying for these programs.
Thank you, Bruce. Our next question is more about workforce development. And as you know, FTA had a $1 million grant last year for our new Transit Workforce Development Center. We're very proud of that, but obviously workforce concerns remain in the transit industry. And so to answer this question, we'll bring in Mary Leary from our Research and Innovation Department. And the question is, how does this funding in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law assist with shortages of operators and drivers, as well as other technical employees that are so badly needed in the transit industry? Mary?
Excellent. And hello, everybody. We're absolutely thrilled that we have the new Transit Workforce Center. We announced this back on August 2nd. And the International Transportation Learning Center is our partner running this new Technical Assistance Center. This $5 million center will be providing a lot of assistance to transit agencies to recruit, hire, train, and retain, and develop really, really good programs to address the workforce needs of today. We know that there are some crises going on from a workforce development perspective, and the Transit Workforce Center will be the venue that FTA is going to be using to be able to push out a lot of really useful information. I'm going to post a couple of links in the chat for everyone. One link will be for further information about the Transit Workforce Center, and the other will be an email that you can use to access information directly to the International Transportation Learning Center, who is hosting this. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Mary. And we just wanted to, as we work through our, trying to figure out why our video isn't working here. As we work through some of our question backlog here, I wanted to note to all of you our thanks for your joining us today. We had at the High Point more than 3,000 attendees from around the transit industry. So thank you all very much for joining us and for your continued interest in FTA and how we intend to implement the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It's a great indicator of how incredibly intense the feeling is about this law around the transit industry and how excited all of you are to get to invest this generational investment into our transit agencies. Our next question is going to go to Dana again. The question here is, what will be the guidance on state-owned enterprises prohibition, which we heard about both here at the Federal Transit Administration as well as during negotiations about the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. Dana, can you help us out with that?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So when Congress enacted the National Defense Authorization Act in fiscal year 2020, it included this provision that is now in Section 5323U of Title 49 that prohibits the use of FTA funding to procure rolling stock from manufacturers that are, quote, owned or controlled by, is a subsidiary of, or is otherwise related legally or financially to a corporation based in certain foreign countries. At the time, we put up a FAQs page on the NDAA provision on the FTA website. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law included an amendment to that section to create an exception for which manufacturers are covered by that broad provision. And that amendment creates an exception that that makes clear that a manufacturer who has a relationship with or investment in a subsidiary, joint venture, or other entity based in one of those foreign countries that does not export rolling stock or components of rolling stock for use in the US are not covered by that federal funding prohibition. FTA is in the process right now of updating that FAQs page to include some guidance on that provision. So we expect to be putting that up in the very near future.
Thanks, Dan. Our next question is for Bruce as well. Bruce is a very popular man here this afternoon. This question wants to know, is there guidance on federal braiding for local matches? FTA put out useful guidance in June 2020, according to the questioner, and wanted to know how the new law affects that with the new programs. Bruce?
Thanks, and we're glad to hear that the federal braiding guidance that we put out is being helpful and used. So I think what we need to do is we'll need to review it and look and see if there's additional programs that have been passed that are now eligible to be used. And maybe I should have made clear, federal braiding essentially means that non-DOT programs can be used as match for some FTA programs. We have a list of which programs are eligible for federal braiding. So I think we can look and see if there are new programs that can be added to that list that are now eligible to be used as local share for FTA grant programs.
Thanks, Bruce. Our next question will bring back Teresa and has to do with the advance appropriations that we discussed earlier. The questioner wants to know, can you clarify whether advance appropriations would not require approval by Congress each year as part of the annual appropriations process, which we're going through right now, and therefore we can assume that these are guaranteed funds as opposed to being already appropriated? Teresa, can you help us out with that one?
Yes, this is actually a new funding source for us this year. And so in a sense, it is a guaranteed appropriation. So while we'll still, for example, this year, it is guaranteed funding. So each year we know that appropriation will be in place. So it's a nice funding flexibility for us.
Thanks, Teresa. So when the appropriations are settled by Congress, regardless of what happens, that our agency partners can be assured that that FY22 advance appropriations funding will be there for FTA to make use of. Is that right?
That is correct.
Excellent. Our next question, we'll go back to Bruce. Smaller transit agencies have had difficulty might have difficulty meeting the new fleet transition plan requirements. And so this questioner wants to know what FTA will do to help support the smaller transit agencies.
I mean, similar to how FTA applied its transit asset management requirements, we understand that one size does not fit all. So the fleet transitions plans, we expect that they'll be scaled to the size and the complexity of the transit systems that are applying. We do over time intend to help develop templates to assist smaller and/or rural agencies develop those plans.
Thanks, Bruce. And I would just reiterate from the standpoint of the entire FTA, including our regional offices, it's incredibly important that all the transit agencies that are looking to either compete for the grant programs that we have or who are just trying to transition their fleets to zero or low emission, work with your regional offices. We have some tremendous public servants in all 10 of our regional offices across the country, and some great regional administrators who are our voice out there in the rest of the United States. Washington and our office here doesn't have all the answers, and they are definitely able to take the unique nature of your region, your transit agency, and the needs of your community into their minds when they're answering your questions. So please make sure that you are in contact with our regional offices as often as possible to make certain that you can take advantage and your communities can take advantage of all of the wonderful changes that are being made thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Our next question is going to bring back Teresa. And this question would like to know, and a lot of folks who work at FTA, believe me, would also like to know this. Will FTA be increasing staff to help support the new funding?
Thanks, Paul. And as was mentioned at the beginning, Congress did ensure that we have resources to carry out the programs as well. So we're currently looking at what resources we need, both from a programmatic perspective, as well as from our oversight perspective, and also looking at what we need in the regional offices, and certainly to support all of you. So yes, we will be increasing our resources to carry out the program, and we are working on a plan right now to what that's going to look like.
Thanks, Teresa. And Teresa's absolutely right. As part of the department that deals with Congress and with our public affairs outreach, Congress was very much had us in mind when writing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. They were aware that it would require new resources and new folks to come on board, and they've provided us with those opportunities. So we're very thankful to them for making certain that they were able to do that in the law. The next question is for Bruce. What is the language in the FAST Act that is related to innovative procurement? We talked a little bit about that earlier with the idea that it would put more buses on the road quicker. And it was a piece of legislation in the FAST Act. And the questioner says, with this law building on this initiative, what can FTA do to assist folks who want to use those innovative procurement techniques, particularly, again, for small agencies? Bruce?
Sure. So everyone understands, the FAST Act included provisions related to innovative procurement, and they included the authority to undertake cooperative procurements led by a nonprofit organization, to use state cooperative procurement schedules. FTA created a joint procurement clearinghouse that can be used to establish joint procurements, as well as the use of leasing arrangements, either for vehicles or for just the propulsion systems. So within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, its intention is to encourage recipients to use these innovative approaches to the extent practicable. And in particular, the Buses and Bus Facilities Formula and Competitive Program includes a requirement that if you're procuring 4 or fewer vehicles in a standalone procurement, that if you have not used one of these innovative procurement methods, that you provide a written explanation to FTA as to why those methods were not used. So FTA intends to provide continued technical assistance on the types of innovative procurements available, some of their advantages, and why agencies would like to use them.
Thanks, Bruce. And we'll keep you here for one other question. Obviously, we've talked about the NOFO coming out for bus and bus facilities and the LONO program in FY22, but the bus and bus facilities from FY21 is still out there, and we're making decisions on that, I know. So perhaps you could kind of update our audience on where the FY21 grant is for the bus and bus facilities program, traditionally the largest discretionary grant program that FTA has had.
Thank you. We've been actively reviewing the applications. Our goal is, and we will ensure that selections for the FY21 Buses and Bus Facilities program are announced before applications are due for the FY22 Buses and Bus Facilities program. We understand it wouldn't be helpful for people to not know whether or not they're going to receive an FY21 selection if they're trying to apply for the FY22 program.
Thank you, Bruce. And our next question is going to be a safety related question. And so we'll get to talk to a new member of the FTA team, our Associate Administrator for Safety, Joe DiLorenzo, who's just joined us within the past month. Joe, the question is, as somebody working at a state safety oversight agency, when do they have to implement a risk-based inspection program?
Sure, Paul, thanks for that question. The requirement to implement that risk-based inspection program is 2 years from when FTA issues its directive, and we're expecting to issue that directive sometime prior to November 15th of 2022. So there's still some time to go, and we'll definitely be keeping folks updated as we go forward with that new program.
Thanks, Joe. We appreciate that. And again, another shout out to sign up for our GovDelivery program. It allows you to select topics that you're interested in receiving. And anytime we send out something on safety, on the CIG program, on our discretionary grants, or on anything else related to FTA, you'll get just those messages sent to you. We already have more than 40,000 entries into the GovDelivery program. And so it's a lot of folks out there in the transit industry and the affiliated industries and companies around it who are able to receive information directly from FTA every time we have something to send out to you. I think we have one last question, and it's going to be for Felicia James. With the availability of multi-year funding through advance appropriations, does FTA intend to enter into full funding grant agreements, that's in our CIG program, that include out-year funds as has been done, through the CIG program?
So thank you, Paul. And yes, essentially, we will continue to do business as we have done with multi-year full funding grant agreements for those projects that are much larger and we cannot pay out in a single year. And we continue to do that mainly because, as many of you all know, the program has grown in the last several years. And to date, we're at the highest number that we've seen in a very long time in the CIG pipeline as far as projects that are pursuing project development and engineering to get to a grant agreement. And so FTA will continue to enter into those full funding grant agreements and continue to plan out and work with project sponsors for the appropriate payout schedules that would align with the growth that we've also seen in the program. But I will note that we have a lot more project sponsors that have entered into the program even in the last year. I believe we're up to about 20 that have submitted for project development.
Thanks, Felicia. And again, the CIG program is one part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that has the potential for tremendous growth. With the funds authorized under the Act, we could see as much as $23 billion invested in the CIG program over the next 5 years. It would be a tremendous increase in CIG funding and in those large community changing projects. And so we hope to see a lot more programs in the pipeline and a lot more funding coming from our friends on Capitol Hill to make those a reality in your community. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate all the questions and all the interest. Again, we had more than 3,000 participants today at various times, and we look forward to talking with all of you throughout the next 5 years to help us implement the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and to put those benefits on the ground in your communities, large and small, across the United States. Again, if you have any questions, if you need to know more about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or if you just want to learn about what's coming up, please visit our website. It's transit.dot.gov. That's transit.dot.gov/BIL. BIL stands for Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. You can learn all you need to know right there about this generational investment in American transit. So for everybody here at the Federal Transit Administration, thank you so much for your time today, and have a great weekend.